On this season of the Keep Growing podcast, we're digging for victory. Here's your host, John Morgan.
This episode, it's coming out a few days later than normal. And that's because I've been feeling a bit under the weather. Now, don't get the wrong idea about that. I know there's, the whole COVID-19 thing right now. I'm fine. What I have is seasonal allergies. Which, hacking and coughing, especially on the podcast, given the subject matter that we're covering this season, might be a little bit awkward. And this episode, I'm planning on doing basically by myself. I don't have an interview this week, and when I do these types of episodes, I usually record them right before I release them. That way I can work on my episode notes and get it ready to roll and get it, kind of finally polished and ready to go. And then I record it and release it. Well, I had planned on releasing this episode on Monday. I was going to record it Sunday evening at home. Well, I decided to mow grass Sunday, and that was very poor planning on my part. I know I have hay fever. I know what time of year it is. And about halfway through mowing the yard, I had probably one of the worst allergy attacks that I've had in years. I sneezed probably 50 times. I was hoarse for the next 2 or 3 days. And I've just felt terrible all week. So you might be wondering, I'm a big fan of gardening. I'm outside all the time working in the garden. How do I do that with allergies? And I think there's a lot of people like me out there that have allergies but also like to garden. So it's kind of this fine balancing act. So there's a few tricks to gardening with allergies. And the first thing is planning out what you're going to do. For me, I knew that this time of year the grass pollen is really bad, so I should have planned out my activities a little bit better on Sunday and recorded this first, and then mowed the yard. But I didn't. And the other thing is knowing what you're allergic to and when to expect those allergies to happen. For me, I am specifically allergic to grass pollen. Tree pollen doesn't bother me in the springtime. And flower pollen doesn't bother me. I can spend all day walking around in the greenhouse here at Bob's with thousands of flowers blooming, and it doesn't bother me one bit. Yet right now, the grass pollen's kind of bad, and even as I'm sitting here, my eyes are on fire. They're itching pretty badly. So that kind of brings me to the last thing, and that is knowing how to treat your allergies. So luckily the worst of my allergies seem to just last a few weeks during the springtime. So I take over-the-counter medications, Zyrtec, and then I use some eye drops and some nasal spray. That seems to help. If I get in really bad trouble, I'll pop a few Benadryl and then take a nice nap. Yeah, gardening with allergies, it can be a challenge, but it isn't impossible. And, well, that was kind of a rabbit trail. This week, the main thing that I want to talk about is planting your victory garden. And planting, it's pretty simple. I mean, basically, you dig a hole, you stick the seeds or the plant in the hole, and you get a plant. Well, okay, roll credits. We're done. There are some more complicated aspects to that. And we're not going to get into kind of all the weird and wacky things. Like if you get into fruit trees, for example, you can do grafting and air layering. And then with some plants you can do, and trees also, you can take cuttings and root those. In fact, a lot of plants that we grow here at Bob's are grown from cuttings. But for this episode, since we're focusing on vegetable gardening, we're going to be looking at seeds and then also transplants. So with seeds, I'm going to divide that up into seeds that you sow indoors and get started, so then you can transplant them outside. And then also seeds that you direct sow into your garden. So when it comes to sowing seeds indoors, something that I like to use are actually the flats that we use here at Bob's that we sell our bedding plants in. So the 32 count flats and let's see, 6, 6, 12, 48 count flats. I do a little math there. Those make great trays for starting vegetables. So when I buy plants like pansies in the fall, I'll save those flats and then refill them in the springtime and plant things in them that I have trouble growing as direct seeded items in the garden. So obviously things like tomatoes, you're not going to start out in the garden. They're just too fiddly to start as seed. You can start those inside under lights, and that's what I do. But then also some plants that you can start outside as seedlings, I find that I have better luck starting indoors. So cucumbers are one example. If I plant cucumbers outside, chances are the birds are going to eat the seedlings when they first come up. But if I sow them inside, let them kind of grow past that first sort of seedling stage, then they're big enough that the birds won't bother them. You know, that's one of those things that you just sort of learn from experience, and it's kind of unique to your own garden. Prior to me getting married and moving to a house down along the Ohio River, when I lived out in the country on the farm that I grew up on, gardening out there, I could plant cucumbers no problem, and for the most part, it seemed like the birds would leave them alone. But for some reason, living in along the Ohio River, my seedlings always disappear. So I found that starting cucumbers indoors there works great. When it comes to sowing seeds indoors, you want to look at the crop time, how long it's going to take to grow it into something that's a transplantable size. And you also want to take into consideration when your last frost date is. So you can kind of work backwards then from your last frost date. For tomatoes, for example, it takes about 6 weeks to grow them to a transplantable size. So you sow them, you get the seedlings started, and I use some fluorescent grow lights to help give mine supplemental lighting, and I grow them right along a south-facing window in the house. So they do tend to sort of reach toward that window, so I kind of have to rotate the flat every other day. After a few weeks, once the weather starts warming up, I'll start taking the tomatoes and other plants that I'm growing outside during the warmer part of the day. And what that does is a process called hardening off. Because if you're growing a plant just inside your house, it doesn't really have a lot of challenges. You gotta kind of take it out into the real world and let it kind of be exposed to things as simple as the wind blowing. Just a gentle breeze on the plants causes their stalks to start to strengthen and thicken up and get stronger. That's all part of hardening off. Also, exposing them to full sunlight. Growing them inside under lights, they're not getting that full sun exposure. So if you take a seedling right out and transplant it directly, chances are if you get a hot sunny day, it's going to bake that little guy. So you need to harden off your seedlings before you take them out to the garden to transplant them. But that brings me to the next thing, and that's direct sowing. So there's a lot of seeds that you can direct sow in your garden. And it's whether you have a victory garden or raised bed, it works for both of them, and it's pretty much the same process. So things like beans and corn, you can make rows and plant them about 1 inch to 2 inches deep under the soil, and about 3 to 6 inches apart. What I like to do with beans and corn, it's a thing that my grandpa did, and I just kind of follow his example. With beans, I'll tend to plant 2 seeds per location. And that just gives you a little bit of extra insurance. And with corn, I'll plant 3 seeds per location. And again, if one doesn't germinate, I've still got 2 others there as a backup. If the crows come in and eat one seedling, still might have another couple to take its place. Also, when it comes to sowing seeds out in the garden or inside, you want to make sure you follow the directions on the seed pack. There's some plants like Swiss chard and leaf lettuce, radishes, beets, different plants like that don't need to be planted very deep. Basically, you can kind of work up an area of fine soil, scatter the seed along the top, and then what I'll do is I'll use my hand to kind of rake over the top of it, and that kind of helps the seeds settle down into the soil. And then once you water it in, that's really all that you need to do to get the sprout. That's another thing that you'll have to take a look at on the seed packs. So some things like leaf lettuce and Swiss chard, you kind of broadcast the seed over the area where you're planting, and then you have to go back in and thin it out. Thinning is one of those important things that you don't want to overlook. I know it's tempting when Swiss chard comes up and you look at this row full of Swiss chard to say, hey, I could kind of double my production if I don't thin it. Well, what's going to happen is as those plants grow, they're going to crowd each other out. And then it can also lead to pest and also disease issues, because where they're all packed in tight together, that's going to hold moisture in around the leaves. So you can end up with fungus issues and things like that. Thinning is an important process that you don't want to skip over. That covers seed sowing. The next thing is transplants. So whether you grow the transplants yourself or you buy them, so things like peppers, I'm terrible at starting peppers from seed. To me, they're just kind of finicky and too hard to start. I always buy my pepper plants as starts here at Bob's. But things like tomatoes, I'll grow them at home. But no matter where you get your transplants from, you want to take into consideration a couple things. One thing is the type of container they're in. If you're growing them in a flat, like I do, a tip that I've kind of learned over the years is that if you let them dry out a little bit before you transplant them, they'll pop up out of the tray a little bit easier. Sometimes if the soil's too wet, the soil will just kind of crumble apart whenever you go to pop it up out of the flat. Another thing is if you grow in those kind of compressed peat moss, or the cow pots that are made from cow manure. Those are designed to break down in the soil, but I tend to find that sometimes they don't break down really very quickly, so you lead to a situation where the plant becomes root bound even though it's planted in the soil. So with one of those containers, what I'll do is I'll tear those containers away before I transplant. I'll either tear them completely away, or I'll just kind of make rips down the side where the roots can sort of escape the container and spread out into the soil. When it comes to planting your transplants, if you're doing a large Victory style garden, like I just planted 48 tomato plants on Monday evening, what I did is, instead of digging 48 individual holes, I just dug a big trench, laid out my transplants, then I went down through with a watering can to get the soil level, where the roots are going to be, to get that area wet. So whether you're digging an individual hole or you're digging a trench, I recommend watering before you plant. And that gets water where it needs to be at the roots. And then also, once you cover it over and kind of firm the soil in around it, I go back and give it a second watering, just as a little bit of extra insurance. Because until those plants get established, they do need a little bit of extra water to promote root growth and also kind of help them through the period that's called transplant shock. no matter how gentle you are with transplanting your seedlings, you are going to tear some roots and kind of damage the root structure a little bit. And they go through a period called transplant shock. Here at Bob's, the way we used to grow all the seedlings, say back in the 70s and 80s, is they would seed everything in a big open tray. And then when they would go to transplant into flats, they would tear those seedlings apart and transplant them. Well, in the 90s, they realized that you could take a tray with individual little tiny plugs in it and sow the seeds in those, and basically each plant gets its own little plug of soil. What that does is it reduces the transplant shock. So just like transplanting plants out into the garden, when we transplant our seedlings here at Bob's into a finished product size like you would find at the garden center, those are being a lot of times transplanted from a plug. And what that's designed to do is reduce transplant shock. So another important thing is during that initial period, say the first couple weeks after you transplant, you also want to avoid adding any fertilizers, because still where they're going through that period of transplant shock and trying to heal their roots basically and establish new root growth, if you fertilize them, you could actually burn the roots. You definitely want to avoid that. When it comes to transplanting, for most plants, you want to transplant them and kind of match up the soil level. So wherever the soil level is in the container that you're transplanting from, you want to match up in the garden too. One of the only exceptions to that is tomato plants. Tomatoes have the amazing ability to produce roots up along the stems. And that's because they're related to potatoes. And potatoes, we hill them for the same reason. So once potatoes get, about a foot tall, you till up the soil on each side, then rake it in against them. And you basically bury the first foot or so of the stems, and then they produce roots off that and produce more potatoes. With tomatoes, you can do the exact same thing. You can take a transplant, bury it a little bit deeper than normal, and that stem section will start to produce roots. And that's good for the tomatoes because it helps give them a little bit more access to water, especially when you get into kind of the mid-summer months and it's a lot drier. So that's kind of my tomato transplanting tip. Let's see. I think that is all that I have here on my sheet of notes. Something that I haven't shared in the last few episodes is some garden wisdom. To end the episode this time, I do have some gardening wisdom, and it comes from Robert Louis Stevenson. So, great author, Jekyll and Hyde. He said, "Don't judge each day by the harvest you reap, but by the seeds you plant." So, until next time, let's keep growing.
Submit your gardening questions at bobsmarket.com/keepgrowing. The Keep Growing podcast is produced by John Morgan. Copyright 2020 Bob's Market and Greenhouses Incorporated.